There's a strange kind of calm that settles over a television studio about 30 seconds before the cameras go live. You'd think it would be chaos. After all, there are producers darting around with headsets, camera operators making last-second adjustments, makeup artists performing miracles under fluorescent lights, cue card handlers double-checking every page, and writers still arguing over whether one word is funnier than another. Oddly enough, it's almost peaceful. Everyone has already done everything they can do. At that point, all that's left is trusting the work. Then comes the countdown. 5, 4, 3. The audience can't hear it, but everyone in the studio feels it. 2, 1. The applause sign lights up. Suddenly the room transforms. Hundreds of people who had been quietly chatting just moments earlier erupt into cheers as the familiar music rolls through the studio. Every week it happens, and every week it somehow still feels exciting. Live television has that effect. You never know what's going to happen. Sometimes a joke lands harder than anyone expected. Sometimes one that seemed unstoppable during rehearsal barely gets a polite chuckle. Sometimes someone laughs so loudly they accidentally become part of the show. That's part of the fun. The cameras swing into place. The lights seem just a little brighter than they did a second ago, and the opening applause carries us into another edition of Weekend Update. My co-anchor welcomes everyone with the ease that only comes from years of doing this. I follow, smiling at the crowd. It's another week, another mountain of headlines, another chance to prove that reality somehow continues to outright every comedy writer in America. If someone had pitched the news from this week as a movie script, the studio executive would have handed it back, covered in notes saying, "Make it more believable." Instead, here we were, reading it. Live, the first story almost wrote itself, breaking news. Only a few hours before airtime, Spirit Airlines had announced it was shutting down operations permanently. Normally, airline stories involve delays, cancellations, or someone arguing with another passenger over whether shoes should stay on during a 6-hour flight. This one managed to top all of those. The headline was so outrageous that the joke practically introduced itself. Spirit Airlines permanently shut down mid-flight. The audience exploded before I could even continue. That's always a good sign. Sometimes people laugh because the joke is clever. Other times they laugh because the premise itself is absurd enough that everyone immediately pictures it. Imagine sitting in seat 23B, halfway through a bag of pretzels, when the pilot casually announces, "Good afternoon, folks. We'd like to thank everyone for flying with us today. Unfortunately, the company no longer exists." Not exactly the message you want over the intercom. Fortunately, reality was less dramatic than the punchline. Still, thousands of passengers had suddenly found themselves stranded in airports. No flights, no employees. No one staffing the check-in desks, which, to be fair, also sounded suspiciously like business as usual. That became the next joke. Spirit proudly maintaining its normal level of customer service, despite shutting down entirely. Sometimes satire requires a complicated setup. Other times, all you have to do is slightly rearrange the facts. The audience understood immediately. Everyone has an airline story. Everyone has spent hours sitting under flickering departure boards, wondering whether Gate B17 actually exists. Everyone has stood in line behind someone, trying to argue that 3 overstuffed duffel bags count as one personal item. Spirit became the symbol for every travel nightmare rolled into one. The laughter rolled through the studio. A strong beginning, exactly what you hoped for. Then the mood shifted. Not dramatically, but enough to remind everyone that the news doesn't stay in one lane for long. One moment we're talking about airlines. The next, we're discussing an alleged assassination attempt connected to the White House correspondents' dinner. Comedy has always had to walk a tightrope. The trick isn't pretending serious events aren't serious. It's acknowledging the absurd details surrounding them without losing sight of reality. One particular detail immediately stood out. The suspect had apparently taken a selfie in his hotel room shortly before the alleged attempt. The caption? "Felt cute, might delete president." It's one of those moments where modern internet culture collides headfirst with history in a way that almost seems impossible. The audience reacted with a mixture of surprise and laughter. Not because the underlying event was funny. It wasn't. But because that caption perfectly reflected the bizarre online habit of turning absolutely everything into social media content. Some people photograph lunch, some photograph sunsets. Apparently, someone decided major historical events also deserved Instagram energy. Only in the internet age could a sentence like that exist. It felt ridiculous. It also felt strangely believable. That's modern life. Before anyone has time to process one headline, another one arrives. King Charles was visiting the United States. Royal visits always create an unusual contrast. The pageantry, the ceremonial greetings, the carefully choreographed photo opportunities. Then someone remembers this is America. Our national response to royalty is generally somewhere between curiosity and, didn't we already settle this? The visit was tied to the 250th anniversary of American independence. History has a terrific sense of irony. Imagine spending centuries ruling colonies only to return centuries later as an honoured guest commemorating the day they officially decided they didn't want you around anymore. History professors probably appreciate that symmetry. Comedians definitely do. Then came the meeting with Zohran Mamdani. The joke imagined the king deciding to take him back to England because he was an Indian treasure. The studio immediately filled with that wonderful mixture of laughter and playful groans. Those groans are almost their own applause. They mean people understood exactly what happened. They know the joke crossed into delightfully terrible territory. That's part of the rhythm of live comedy. Some laughs come with applause, some come with people covering their faces. Both count. The royal visit continued supplying material. King Charles was also reportedly seeking the release of a British hostage supposedly being held by an American terrorist. That's not exactly the kind of diplomatic headline anyone expects. Growing up, we mostly heard about America helping rescue hostages. Now the setup had flipped. Sometimes international relations feel less like politics and more like the writer's room accidentally swapping scripts. Then there was the ceremonial gift. The king presented the president with the original bell from a British submarine. An elegant gesture, a symbolic gesture. Naturally, the joke immediately transformed it into a phone. If you ever need to get hold of us, the imagined line went, just give us a ring. Simple, clean. Then came the follow-up. Maybe there was already another British royal contact saved in the president's phone. Under the name Andrew, Iceland. That one hit with exactly the reaction you'd expect. Big laugh, a few gasps, then bigger laughter. Comedy often lives in that tiny space between recognition and surprise. The audience gets where you're going half a second before you arrive. That anticipation is part of what makes the payoff work. From there, we moved into the Supreme Court. The transition itself almost felt jarring. 1 second, we're talking about submarine bells. The next, we're discussing voting rights. That's another challenge of the update format. The emotional gears shift constantly. Legal experts had described a recent Supreme Court ruling as taking a wrecking ball to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That description alone sounded dramatic. The response reframed it from another perspective. For many black Americans, the comparison wasn't a wrecking ball. It felt more like a fire hose. The audience reacted exactly as expected. First, a collective groan. Then laughter. Then someone somewhere muttered what everyone else was thinking. Too real. Comedy occasionally lands because it's exaggerated. Other times it lands because it barely exaggerates anything at all. Those are usually the moments that linger longest after the applause fades. Not every laugh is carefree. Some arrive carrying a little discomfort with them. Sometimes that's the point. As we turn the page to the next headline, I found myself thinking once again about the strange profession we'd chosen. Spend all week reading stories that make you shake your head. Spend another few days trying to find the one angle that makes people laugh without ignoring what actually happened. Then step under the lights and hope the audience is willing to come along for the ride. So far, they were, and we were only getting started. The applause from the previous joke faded, and for a split second, the studio settled into one of those familiar little silences that only exists on live television. It never lasts more than a heartbeat, but it always feels longer when you're sitting behind the desk. One headline ends, another begins, and somewhere in that tiny pause, everyone collectively wonders, where could the news possibly go next? Experience has taught me the answer, anywhere. usually somewhere stranger. The next story took us into the Oval Office, where President Trump had met with the Artemis II astronauts. Space has always occupied an unusual place in American culture. Mention astronauts, and people immediately think about courage, engineering, discovery, and humanity pushing beyond what once seemed impossible. Then politics wanders into the room carrying muddy boots. According to the report, the president looked at the astronaut and announced, "I like space." That was the quote. Just those 3 words, civil enough that nobody could possibly misunderstand them, which somehow made them even funnier. The audience laughed almost immediately, partly because everyone expected something more elaborate. A speech, an inspirational observation, maybe a comment about exploration or science. Instead, the statement had all the complexity of someone looking at a puppy and saying, "Nice dog." The follow-up imagined those same words appearing in Melania Trump's wedding vows. That image carried its own kind of absurdity. Wedding vows are usually full of promises about love, commitment, and building a future together. Imagining one spouse simply declaring, "I like space," painted a wonderfully awkward picture, not because anyone believed it had happened, but because comedy often works by dropping an ordinary sentence into the least ordinary setting imaginable. The audience rewarded the mental picture with another burst of laughter. By now, the rhythm of the show had settled in headline. Reaction, punchline, next headline. Each story lasted only moments before another one arrived. The pace almost mirrored the speed of scrolling through news on a phone. Except this version came with studio lights and several hundred people laughing together instead of silently shaking their heads alone. The next headline introduced Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth testifying before Congress. His photograph appeared on the screen. Before discussing any testimony, the joke imagined the picture being taken immediately after a bartender had refused him another drink. It was one of those visual setups that barely needed explanation. The audience filled in the rest. Sometimes the shortest joke gives viewers room to complete it themselves. And that participation makes it land even harder. Then attention shifted to the reported estimate for the war in Iraq. 25 billion. The figure sounded staggering all by itself. The punchline simply added 2 words. A gallon. The studio erupted again. Inflation jokes have become their own category of comedy because nearly everyone has experienced walking into a shop, buying 3 ordinary items and somehow spending far more than expected. Applying that feeling to military spending created ridiculous comparison. It also opened the door to another question. How had the war supposedly already reached such an enormous cost? The answer, naturally, wasn't meant to be serious. What are we bombing them with? White House ballrooms? The image was so unexpected that laughter rolled through the room before people had even finished picturing it. Comedy thrives on surprise. Nobody anticipates a ballroom becoming military equipment. That's precisely why it works. By this point, I could almost feel the audience relaxing. They understood the pace. They understood the rules. Every new headline represented another opportunity for reality to accidentally become satire. Sometimes it hardly needed any assistance. The subject changed again. A federal appeals court had restricted abortion access by blocking the mailing of a widely used abortion medication. The headline itself was entirely serious. The joke that followed took a sharp turn into absurdity. It suggested that any drug could become an abortion drug. If someone took enough of it, the laughter came in waves. Then something happened that only live audiences can produce. One person clapped. Just one. The sound echoed through the studio with almost comic precision. A single enthusiastic clap in a room where everyone else was still laughing. It immediately became part of the performance. The response came naturally. Don't! One guy clap. That line earned another Raw Live comedy, has a wonderful habit of incorporating accidents. A dropped cue card, someone laughing too loudly. One isolated clap arriving at exactly the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right moment. Those moments can never be rehearsed. They're gifts. The news moved on once more. The State Department, according to reports, planned to introduce a special edition passport featuring an image of Donald Trump. That headline almost sounded fictional before anyone even attempted a joke. Passports are practical objects. They're meant to prove identity. nobody expects them to become collector's editions. The joke imagined the passport serving as a permanent reminder of why someone had left the country in the first place. The audience instantly recognized the exaggeration. Then came another observation. The image apparently looked as though it was burning a hole through the Declaration of Independence. Visual jokes can be especially satisfying because everyone creates a slightly different version inside their own imagination. Some people picture a tiny scorch mark, others imagine dramatic flames consuming parchment. The more vividly each audience member imagines it, the funnier the joke becomes. Another headline arrived. This one came from Florida. Of course it did. There are certain places that have developed reputations in comedy, fairly or unfairly, for producing stories that seem almost custom-built for late-night television. Florida headlines often arrive, sounding as though someone generated them by spinning several unrelated wheels. Occupation, location, wild claim. Random luxury vehicle. This story checked nearly every box. A homeless man had allegedly been arrested after trespassing on a yacht. His explanation? He insisted he was simply looking after it for his friend, President Trump. Already a strange claim. But he didn't stop there. According to the report, he also claimed to have been mayor of New York City. That final detail tied everything together. The audience recognized the obvious impossibility immediately. Sometimes a joke doesn't require adding anything. Merely repeating reality in the right order does the work. There was even time for a playful aside about another comedian's impression of the character. Those little behind-the-scenes references always remind everyone that comedy is collaborative. People see two anchors behind a desk. In reality, there are writers, performers, producers, researchers, directors, editors, and dozens of others helping shape every minute. No joke exists entirely on its own. The momentum continued. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had suggested that it was possible America had already had a gay president. Historical speculation has a way of inviting endless debate. The joke didn't attempt to answer the question seriously. Instead, it offered one deliberately outrageous guess. Perhaps it was the president who seemed particularly fascinated by ballrooms and the village people. The audience reacted with exactly the combination of laughter and playful disbelief that such speculation invites. Political humour often functions less as a declaration than as an invitation. It asks the audience to connect dots, recognise references, and laugh at the absurd image that forms in the process. Another page turned. Another headline waited. President Trump was reportedly claiming that a BBC documentary had altered his January 6th speech using artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has become the universal explanation for nearly everything these days. An odd photograph? AI, a strange recording. AI, someone saying something embarrassing. Maybe AI again. The premise naturally lent itself to a visual gag. The familiar clip began. We fight. We fight like hell. Then, instead of continuing normally, the imagined AI alteration abruptly veered into an advertisement for horny MILFs in your area. The studio dissolved into laughter. The contrast made the joke. One moment viewers expected an important political speech. The next, it sounded as though the internet had interrupted with one of its famously ridiculous pop-up advertisements. Everyone who has ever browsed the web recognised the reference instantly. Shared experience is powerful fuel for comedy. Not everyone follows every political story. Almost everyone has encountered an advertisement they'd rather not have seen. As the laughter gradually settled, I glanced down at the next headline. The stack of stories still wasn't getting any smaller. Reality, apparently, had remained extremely busy all week. And we still had plenty left to cover. There comes a point in every live broadcast when you realise you're approaching the finish line. You can almost sense it without looking at the rundown. The stack of headlines has grown noticeably thinner. The audience has settled into the rhythm of the show, and everyone in the studio is operating with the quiet confidence that comes from surviving another whirlwind tour through the week's news. Of course, surviving is the operative word. The news has a remarkable ability to accelerate once you think you've caught up with it. Every headline seems determined to prove that the previous one wasn't nearly as unusual as you first believed. The next report centred on rumours about another possible departure from the Trump administration. According to a new report, FBI Director Kash Patel could be the next official to leave. Political administrations are no strangers to personnel changes. Cabinets shift, advisors resign, directors are replaced, and speculation becomes its own full-time occupation for journalists. Washington often resembles a revolving door that never quite stops turning. The joke didn't focus on policy or politics. Instead, it focused on a photograph. It suggested that Patel already looked as though he had one eye out the door. The audience laughed immediately because everyone recognized the familiar expression. We've all seen someone who appears mentally halfway through their resignation before they've officially announced it. Whether it's the employee who has already packed half the decorations off their desk or the student counting the minutes until the final bell, the look is universal. A single image can sometimes tell a story more effectively than a lengthy explanation. That's one of the pleasures of visual comedy. You don't need to over-explain the premise. People instinctively understand it. The laughter rolled comfortably through the studio, giving everyone a chance to breathe before the evening's final story. As often happens, the last headline shifted completely away from politics. Hollywood entered the conversation. The film Michael had reportedly earned $97 million during its opening weekend, making it the highest-grossing opening ever for a music biopic. By any measure, that represented a significant achievement. Audiences had clearly turned out in impressive numbers, and the box office figures reflected that enthusiasm. For a brief moment, the headline almost sounded refreshingly straightforward. Then came the punchline. Even with that remarkable opening, the film hadn't managed to crack the top 10 grossest weekends involving Michael Jackson. The audience reacted with the familiar mixture of laughter and exaggerated groans that had become a recurring soundtrack throughout the evening. Those reactions are fascinating. A groan doesn't necessarily mean a joke failed. Quite often, it means the opposite. It's the audience acknowledging that they know exactly where the joke went and wishing, in the most affectionate way possible, that it hadn't gone there quite so boldly. That combination of groans and laughter echoed around the studio before gradually fading into applause. The camera stayed on us for another moment. From home, viewers saw two anchors smiling behind the desk. What they didn't see was everything happening just beyond the frame. Crew members were already preparing for the next segment. Camera operators eased their equipment into new positions. Producers quietly confirmed timings through their headsets. Cue card pages were gathered into neat stacks. The controlled chaos that disappears during a live broadcast immediately returned the second the final joke landed. That's the strange magic of television. The audience experiences a smooth 20-minute conversation. Behind the scenes, dozens of people have spent the entire week making that conversation appear effortless. Every headline begins long before airtime. Researchers sift through countless news stories. Writers debate which angle feels freshest. Someone inevitably argues that a joke should lose 3 words. Someone else insists it needs 4 more. A reference that everyone loved on Tuesday suddenly feels dated by Thursday because the news has already moved on. An entirely new story breaks on Friday afternoon, forcing everyone to rewrite pages they'd already considered finished. By the time the audience sits down, the material has been revised, trimmed, expanded, and rearranged more times than anyone can count. Then, somehow, it all has to sound spontaneous. That's the challenge. The best live comedy doesn't feel manufactured. It feels like you're simply reacting to the world in real time. Of course, the world rarely cooperates by providing orderly material. Instead, it hands you a collection of headlines that seem determined to compete with one another. An airline unexpectedly shuts down, leaving travellers stranded and somehow inviting comparisons to its own customer service. A royal visit commemorates American independence while generating jokes about history, diplomacy, and symbolic gifts. An online selfie caption becomes one of the most bizarre details attached to a deeply serious news story. A Supreme Court ruling sparks discussion about voting rights. Astronauts visit the Oval Office. Congressional testimony inspires jokes about inflation. Court decisions, passports, yachts, political speculation, artificial intelligence, and Hollywood all squeeze into the same broadcast. Right together, the list sounds almost impossible. Experienced separately over the course of a week, however, it somehow becomes ordinary. Perhaps that's what makes late-night news comedy unique. It's less about inventing absurdity than recognising it. Reality arrives carrying enough contradictions to keep writers busy indefinitely. The job is simply to organise them into a conversation that audiences can follow. Humour becomes less of an escape from the news than a way of processing it. People laugh because the stories surprise them. They laugh because they recognise familiar frustrations. They laugh because, occasionally, the only sensible response to an especially strange headline is to shake your head and smile. There's a shared understanding inside a studio audience that doesn't always translate onto paper. Hundreds of strangers arrive with different opinions, different experiences, and different expectations. For 20 minutes, they react together. One joke earns immediate applause. Another produces hesitant laughter before building into something larger. A particularly sharp line earns equal parts cheers and theatrical groans. Even the unexpected moments become memorable. A single audience member clapping at precisely the wrong time becomes part of the performance. Someone's uncontrollable laugh spreads to the people sitting nearby. Another person covers their face after an especially outrageous punchline, while everyone around them laughs even harder. Those little moments can't be scripted. They're reminders that comedy remains a conversation rather than a lecture. The audience participates every bit as much as the performers. As the programme approached its close, I found myself appreciating that relationship more than ever. Television changes constantly. News cycles move faster every year. Stories that dominate headlines on Monday can disappear entirely by Friday afternoon. Social media ensures that millions of people have already encountered most of the week's biggest headlines before the show even begins. That means the challenge isn't simply repeating the news. It's finding a fresh perspective, a different angle, a surprising observation that encourages viewers to look at a familiar headline in a new way. Sometimes that observation lasts only a sentence. Sometimes it's a visual image. Sometimes it's nothing more complicated than pointing out how strange the truth already is. When the final applause arrived, it carried a different energy from the opening cheers. At the beginning of the show, the applause welcomed possibility. At the end, it celebrated completion. Another week's headlines had been gathered, examined, questioned, and transformed into a shared experience. The cameras would soon stop rolling. The audience would file out into the night, discussing their favourite jokes. The writers would probably already be talking about next week. News never waits. By the time everyone reached home, another headline was almost certainly appearing somewhere. Another unexpected photograph. Another surprising quote. Another story that would make someone in the writer's room look up from their laptop and say, "You're not going to believe this." And, more often than not, they would be right. Because no matter how many years pass, no matter how many broadcasts are completed or headlines are read, one lesson remains remarkably consistent. Reality never runs out of material. It simply hands us another week, another stack of stories, and another opportunity to gather around a desk, look directly into the camera, and try to make sense of it all, one laugh at a time.